They tell you the guild has a code. They say it like it means something, like there's honor in the work, some kind of moral architecture underneath all the blood and carbon scoring and long silences in the dark between star systems. I used to believe it. I believed it the way a man believes in the roof over his head, not because he thinks about it, but because the alternative, standing out in the open, exposed, is too cold to consider. My name doesn't matter. What I was called in those years was simply the hunter. That was enough. It had always been enough. I was good at the work, better than most. The trick, if you can call it that, is detachment. You don't hate the marks. You don't pity them. You read their file on the transport in, you memorize their face, and you find them. The rest is just applied physics. Force and reaction. Cause and consequence. I had reduced a complicated universe down to those terms, and for a long time it kept me functional. The outer systems in those years were a particular kind of lawless. The old empire had collapsed 5 years prior, not all at once, but in the way that empires actually fall, which is slowly and then suddenly, like a man with a bad heart who runs for a transport and keels over in the street. The new republic was busy consolidating the core worlds, and had neither the ships nor the political will to police the fringes. So the fringes policed themselves, which meant they didn't, which meant the work was plentiful. Grief Karga ran our operation out of a cantina on a dust-caked station at the edge of legitimate space. He was a large man, well-dressed for the neighborhood, with the kind of easy smile that belongs on a man who has never personally done anything dangerous but has arranged for dangerous things to happen at a comfortable remove. He liked me. He liked how quickly I cleared his board. He handed me a tracking fob one evening, folded his hands on the table, and told me this one was different. "Private client," he said. "No file, no name, just an age and a last known location." "Age 50. The fob was warm in my hand. I turned it over. Standard issue, but the frequency was guild encrypted at a level I hadn't seen before. Someone with resources had paid for this. "The client uses Imperial bodyguards," Karga said, in the tone of a man mentioning the weather. I looked at him. "Former Imperial," he amended. "There's a difference." "There isn't." He smiled and slid a sealed case across the table. I opened it. Inside, stacked in neat ingots, was a quantity of Beskar, the old iron, the ancestral metal, the stuff that hadn't been seen in any significant quantity since the Purge. My Purge, though I rarely called it that. The night I became an orphan and then became something else. I closed the case without expression. "This is a great deal of metal," I said. "The client is motivated." I took the job. The planet the fob led me to was the kind of world that exists on no official registry, a dry, terracotta wasteland with 2 pale moons and a wind that scraped the skin off anything exposed to it. The locals were called Ugnaughts, small and stout and tired-looking, and a single one of them was waiting beside his pair of riding animals when I sat down. He introduced himself as Keel. He said he had been expecting someone like me for some time, and that he wished to assist so that his valley might be rid of the criminal element that had infested it. "I have spoken," he said, and that was apparently the end of the negotiation. I let him teach me to ride the animals, which was an undignified hour of my life, and he led me across the flats toward a fortified compound that squatted against the red rock like something that had grown there rather than been built. A facility. 40-odd armed men, maybe more. The kind of place where things were kept that someone didn't want found. I almost didn't make it through alone. There was a guild droid on site, an assassination unit, IG series, all skeleton and exposed actuators, and a voice like a malfunctioning speaker who was working the same contract. We made a temporary arrangement. The droid's combat calculus was excellent. Its judgment was poor. We found the target in the deepest room of the compound, in a hovering cradle, sealed behind a mag-locked door. I remember the sound the lock made when it opened. I remember the quality of the light inside that room. Yellowish, warm, like the inside of something alive. And then the cradle rotated slowly toward me, and I looked down and I had a problem. The mark was a child. Not a human child, some other species, green-skinned, enormous-eyed, ears that swept back from the skull like folded wings. 50 years old according to the file, but the file had failed to mention that 50 years was apparently infancy for this particular kind of creature. It was the size of a large cat. It looked up at me with the attentiveness of something that was deciding whether or not to trust what it was seeing. The droid had already raised its weapon. Contracts said bring the target in dead or alive. The droid had run the calculation and selected the more efficient option. I shot the droid through the primary processor before I had consciously decided to do it. Later, I would try to explain this to myself. The code says you don't interfere with another guild member's contract. The code says the client's terms govern the job. The code says a lot of things that I had followed without question for 15 years. I stood in that room with a destroyed droid at my feet and a child staring at me from a hovering cradle, and I told myself I had made a practical decision. The bounty specified alive, and alive was worth more than dead, and that was simply the math. That was the first lie I told myself about what was happening. I brought the child back to my ship. I brought it to the client. The client was a pale, soft-spoken man in a dim room who wore his authority the way some men wear fine clothes, not to impress others, but because he simply could not conceive of presenting himself otherwise. He had the eyes of a functionary, a man who had served a system so long that he had ceased to exist outside of it. He had a doctor with him, young man, nervous, with the specific nervousness of someone who knew things they wished they didn't know. The doctor looked at the child in a way that made something pull tight across my sternum. I took the payment, Imperial Remnant coin, newly minted heavy. I walked out. I got approximately 40 minutes away before I turned the ship around. I have run the calculation many times since then. I have tried to locate the precise mechanism, the specific input that caused the output to be. Go back. I have never found a satisfying answer. The best I can offer is this. I had been made as a child by people who believed that some things were worth protecting regardless of cost. They were dead. The belief apparently was not. The compound was guarded now. Word had gotten out, the guild, Karga. Everyone knew I'd delivered and everyone would shortly know I'd gone back. I dismantled the guards efficiently and took the child from the room they were keeping it in. The doctor was still there. He did nothing to stop me. He looked, if anything, relieved. I told him to tell them. It was already gone when I arrived. They won't believe me, he said. No, I agreed, but it buys time. I took the child and I ran. The next several weeks were the worst of my professional life, and paradoxically, the most alive I had felt since I could remember. Every guild hunter in range was running my signal. The fobs don't discriminate. Once your tracking frequency is burned to enough devices, you become the mark, and there's no arguing with the physics of it. I had a child who could not defend itself, a ship that was functional but not fast, and the combined attention of people whose job was to find things that didn't want to be found. I had been one of those people. I knew exactly how we thought. The child, I had taken to thinking of it simply as the child, because numbing it felt like a commitment I wasn't ready to make, was unreasonably calm about all of this. It sat in its cradle and watched me with those vast dark eyes, and occasionally made sounds that I could not interpret but which did not seem like distress. It ate when I fed it, slept when I left it in the dark, and once, when I had been grazed by a bolt and was sitting in the cargo hold pressing a thermal pad to my side and breathing through the pain, it reached out with one small three-fingered hand and touched my arm. I looked at the hand, I looked at the child. I know, I said, I'm fine. It wasn't an explanation, and the child probably didn't understand it. But it was the first full sentence I had said to another living creature in approximately 3 weeks that wasn't a threat or a demand. And I noted the strangeness of that. I went back to Keel's planet first. The old Ugnaughtian had seen things before. He took one look at the situation and began repairing my ship without being asked, which is the highest form of practical compassion I know. "You have changed the terms of the arrangement," he observed, working under the chassis. "I have. They will not stop coming." "I know." He was quiet for a while, then he said, "The child is strong, I have seen it. There is something in it that is not ordinary." He was right about that, though I wouldn't fully understand how right until later. What I knew then was more modest. I had a living creature in my care that could not protect itself, and something in me, the part that had been forged in the fire of a childhood I rarely looked at directly, had decided that this was now my problem in the deepest possible sense. Not a job, not a contract. Mine. The guild found us, of course. 3 hunters, coordinated, which was unusual. Guild work is typically solitary, and coordination means someone has paid for upgrade access. They hit us in the canyon 2 kilometers from Keel's homestead. I handled 2 of them. The third got a shot off that spun me and put me face down in the red dirt with a ringing in my skull and the taste of copper in my mouth. The shot that should have finished me didn't come. When I got upright, the third hunter was on his back. The child was hovering in the air 6 centimeters above its cradle, one hand raised, eyes half closed. The hunter's neck was not broken, but he was very thoroughly unconscious. I stood there for a long moment. The child descended gently back into its cradle. It blinked at me. It made one of its unintelligible sounds. "I've seen a lot of things," I said. It blinked again. "That's the first time I've seen that." I picked up my weapon, checked the charge, and started moving. The child rode at my side, and we did not discuss it further. I cannot tell you exactly when I stopped thinking of it as the child and started thinking of it as mine. It was not a single moment. It was a series of small decisions, each one individually deniable, that in aggregate amounted to something that a more sentimental man than I would have called love. The first time someone tried to take it from me, and I killed them without hesitation before they had finished explaining the offer. The first time it got sick, some reaction to something it ate, a rattling in the small chest that went on for 2 nights while I sat outside the cradle and ran calculations I could not control. And I understood that there was an outcome in this universe I was genuinely not prepared to face. The first time I called it by a name, quietly in the dark of the ship when I thought it was asleep. Its name was Gragu. I had not given it that name. I had learned it by accident from a source I trusted, and the moment I had it in my head it was permanent. You can't unlearn a name. The moment you know what something is called, it becomes a different kind of thing, more real, more fragile, more worth protecting. I had been operating as a man with nothing to lose for most of my adult life. That posture has advantages. It makes you very difficult to threaten, because threat requires leverage, and a man who holds nothing dear gives the threatener very little to grip. I had been comfortable in that emptiness. I had, without quite admitting it, curated it. Gragu destroyed all of that within about 6 weeks of my custody, and I could not bring myself to resent him for it. We found allies in improbable places. That is how it tends to work, in my experience. You don't recruit allies, exactly. You stumble into them sideways and discover that their interests happen to align with yours for the moment. There was a woman named Dune on a farming settlement deep in the outer systems, a former Alliance soldier who had come out of the war with the specific exhaustion of someone who had believed in something completely, and then watched it fail to become what they had fought for. She was large, pragmatic, funny in the way of people who use humor as armor, and she could take an ungodly amount of punishment without going down. I found her in a village that was being systematically dismantled by a raider group equipped with Imperial surplus. We cleared the raiders together. It was not the most complex operation of my career, but it reminded me that some problems are solved more efficiently with 2 people than 1. She looked at Gragu and then looked at me. "That's the complication," she said. It was not a question. That's the child. The whole guild is flagged on you. I know. She nodded, the slow nod of someone assembling a picture from scattered fragments, and finding it makes a kind of sense. She didn't offer to join up. I didn't ask. But when the situation clarified itself later into something more dangerous than either of us had anticipated, she was there. There was also the armorer. My armorer. The woman who keeps the forge, who holds the creed, who knows what was taken from us, and why the weight of it must be carried rather than set down. She worked in the tunnels under the city, in a forge that had survived a dozen purges by going underground. She hammered Beskar in the old way and spoke in the cadences of a faith that most people had forgotten. When I brought her the metal the client had paid me in, she made me armor from it, shaped it to my measurements, returned what had been taken from our people, one piece at a time. I told her about Gragu. Not everything, I didn't have everything to tell, but enough. She was quiet for a long time. You have a foundling, she said finally. I don't know what I have. A foundling, until it can be returned to its own people, or until it comes of age. You are its father now by the creed. I said nothing. This is the way, she said, which is how we close all our sentences that don't need anything added to them. This is the way. I had said it 10,000 times in my life, the verbal equivalent of a full stop. Conversation ended, terms accepted, move forward. I had said it about jobs, about losses, about decisions I had made in the dark and had to live with in the light. I said it now about this, about Gragu, and the words fit differently than they ever had. Heavier, more permanent, like iron rather than air. The client sent someone better than guild hunters. His name was Gideon. Moff Gideon, late of the Imperial Security Bureau, now running a remnant operation in the outer sectors with the quiet efficiency of a man who had survived the fall of his government by making himself indispensable to what came after. He had resources, patience, and the specific quality of ruthlessness that comes not from cruelty but from ideology. He genuinely believed in what he was doing, which made him far more dangerous than a man who was simply in it for money or power. He wanted Gragu, not to destroy him. He'd had opportunities to destroy him and declined them. He wanted the child's blood, the specific, rare quality in the child's biology that the doctor had been studying. Whatever that quality was, Gideon believed it was worth burning half a sector to obtain. I did not learn all of this at once. I learned it piece by piece, the way you learn that an enemy is more dangerous than you thought, through losses, through close escapes, through the testimony of people who had been in his orbit and gotten out carrying scars and information. Cara Dune knew pieces. Keel knew pieces. The armorer, operating from her tunnels with the patience of someone who has outlasted empires, knew other pieces. Together the picture assembled into something I could act on, and I am a man who finds it easier to act than to contemplate. Gideon found us on a city world, a mid-range settlement with enough population to require real infrastructure but not enough governance to have reliable law. He arrived with troopers, the Imperial surplus variety, and also with something else. Something new. Dark troopers, not the old organic ones but mechanical, phage-armored units taller than a man by a full head, driven by no hunger or fear or hesitation. They had no faces. They ran their objective matrices and they executed. I had encountered most of the things that could threaten me in the inhabited galaxy, and I had never encountered anything quite like this. We were inside a cantina when they moved on us. 3 of us, me, Dune, and a guild bounty hunter named Davin, who had the misfortune of having been nearby when the situation found him, and the basic decency not to walk away. The troopers came through the walls, literally through the walls, not through the doors, which told me something about their threat assessment protocols. They did not bother with conventional entry because conventional defenses were not their concern. I took one apart with sustained fire at close range, and close range still meant it got its hands on me, and I felt my ribs flex in a way they were not designed to flex. Dune handled one with the particular efficiency of a soldier who has been in worse spots and is not impressed. Davin, to his credit, held the third off long enough for Dune to finish it, though he took a hit that put him down for 3 days. But there were more where those came from. That was the nature of Gideon's operation, sustainable escalation. We damaged his assets and he made more. He had manufacturing, personnel, and the patience of a man playing a long game. We were improvising. That is, as I have said, a human skill, but there are limits to what improvisation can sustain against institutional force. Gragu was taken. I will describe this plainly, because there is no way to describe it that does not leave a mark, and I have no interest in softening it. I had him. I had him safe. I had made every calculation I knew how to make, and deployed every resource I had access to, and it was not enough. Gideon's troopers came in a pattern I hadn't mapped, through a vector I had not adequately defended, and they took him from me while I was occupied elsewhere. By the time I reached the room, there was only the empty cradle and the faint heat signature of a ship that was already burning atmosphere. I stood in that room for exactly 4 seconds. Then I went to get him back. What followed was the kind of operation that does not look like an operation from the inside. From the inside, it looks like a series of decisions made under pressure, each one consuming the previous one, until you are so deep in the current that swimming back is no longer a meaningful concept. You go forward or you go under. Keel died. He came with us and he died in the gap between the landing pad and the ship, covering our approach, and the shot that killed him was clean and he went down without theatrics. He had been a good man in the full sense, competent, principled, kind in the particular way of people who have seen enough to know what kindness costs and pay it anyway. I had known him for a matter of months. I had known what he was within an hour of meeting him. The galaxy makes some of these economies. It gives you a person whole in a short time and then takes them before the arithmetic seems fair. There is not much I can do with grief in the middle of an operation. I filed it in the way that soldiers file things during battle, compressed, sealed, stored for later. For afterward, if there was an afterward. We boarded Gideon's cruiser with what we had. Myself, Dune, a recovered Davin, and 2 others who had thrown their lot in with ours for reasons that were their own. 4.5 competent people against an Imperial warship. I have done worse math. The dark troopers were the critical variable. They were housed in suspension bays along the primary corridor, locked in, inert, waiting for a trigger signal to wake them. There were enough of them to take all of us apart if they came online simultaneously. The corridor between us and the bridge was long, and the bridge was where Gideon was, and Gideon was where I needed to be. I made a decision that I will not pretend was heroic. It was a calculation. Someone had to hold the trooper bay and someone had to get to the bridge, and I was the only person present who had any realistic chance of getting through Gideon's personal guard alone. So I went forward and I told the others to hold the bay, and I did not stop to think about what holding the bay would actually require. The ship had internal comms. I could hear what was happening behind me while I moved forward. I heard Dune's voice, clipped and steady, calling distances and contact counts. I heard Davin, less steady but holding. I moved faster. Gideon's private corridor was quieter than I expected. He was waiting. Of course he was waiting. A man like Gideon does not flee. He repositions. He had the bridge, the controls, and the specific confidence of someone who believes that institutional force will ultimately prevail over individual obstinacy. He believed I was an anomaly, a broken variable in his model, a guild asset who had gone rogue for reasons he could quantify but not predict. He believed Gragu was already secured, and that I was operating on emotion, and that emotion was a vulnerability he could exploit. He had a sword, an ancient weapon, black as the space between stars, with an edge that could part Beskar if you caught it at the right angle. He had taken it from someone, I knew, though I did not know the full story then. He used it the way men use things they understand intellectually but not in the bone, competently, without the ease of a practitioner. I took 3 wounds getting through his guard. None of them were fatal. I am not sure all of them were accidental. There is a part of my neurology that, in extreme moments, does not distinguish between pain and information, and the information those wounds gave me was the information I needed to close the distance and put him down. He was not dead when I was done. I had made that choice deliberately. Dead men answer no questions and close no negotiations. I cuffed him to a console and found Grogu in the detention level, in a cell designed for creatures of his size, sitting in the precise posture of a creature that has decided to wait rather than panic. He saw me come through the door and made a sound. I knelt down to his level. "I know," I said. "It took longer than it should have." He reached up and grabbed two of my fingers in his entire fist. I stayed there for a moment, kneeling on the floor of an Imperial detention cell with Grogu's hand around my fingers, and did not try to describe to myself what I was feeling, because some things are not improved by description. The Dark Troopers woke up. I do not know the exact trigger, residual command signal, automated protocol, proximity to their primary quarry. It doesn't matter. What matters is that 23 of them came online simultaneously in the suspension bay and began systematically destroying everything between themselves and Grogu. I got him behind me. The others formed up. We had good cover, limited angles, and a combined rate of fire that was impressive but insufficient. You can cut a Dark Trooper down with sustained effort, but sustained effort requires time, and the Trooper's tactical algorithm does not acknowledge attrition the way organic soldiers do. They do not hesitate when their numbers drop. They do not calculate survival. They do not have the particular failure mode of men who begin to doubt. They just kept coming. I remember Dune bleeding from her forehead and firing without pause. I remember Davin with an empty cell trying to reload with one hand. I remember the corridor filling with smoke from burning chassis and the floor getting hot underfoot, and thinking, with the calm that descends in extremity, that this was the scenario I had no answer for. The ship received a transmission request. It came through on an encrypted channel I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. The timing was wrong for anything good. I answered. The visual that came up was a man in dark robes aboard a small vessel, hood back, face visible. Young-looking, in the way of people whose baseline state is an extraordinary self-possession that ages them past youth without aging them. He said he had received a distress signal from the ship, from Grogu, specifically, which was not something I had known Grogu could do. He said he had come. "Let him land," I said to the bridge crew, who were still technically Gideon's personnel, and were operating in the specific compliance mode of people who have decided the current authority arrangement is temporary. None of them argued. What happened next is not something I describe in detail, not because I lack the vocabulary, but because there are moments that belong to the people who were in them and resist being translated into report language. A single man came aboard. He came through those Dark Troopers the way wind comes through a forest, present everywhere at once, bending nothing that did not need to be bent, leaving the corridor clear behind him in a way that seemed to involve no particular effort. He was between us and the troopers, and then the troopers were simply not an operational factor anymore. He was the kind of person that Grogu had been waiting for. That much was obvious the moment they were in the same room. Grogu looked at him the way a child looks at a place that is home before they have the language to call it that. I had known this was coming. I had known, in the part of myself that operates below what I will say out loud, that Grogu was not mine to keep. He needed his own people, his own training, his own kind of future that I was not equipped to give him. I had protected him, and I would protect him with my life until the moment was right, and then I would let him go, and that was the whole of the thing. The moment was this. I knelt down again, third time kneeling on the floor of an Imperial ship. There is probably something to be said about that. Grogu looked at me, the enormous dark eyes, the ears, the three-fingered hand extended. I reached up and took off the helmet. I had not taken it off in front of anyone except the armorer since I was a child. The creed is explicit. You do not show your face. I had followed that rule without exception, without resentment, because the rules were the architecture, and the architecture was what was left of the world I had come from. I let him see my face. I do not know exactly what he saw. I know what I was in that moment: tired, scarred in ways both visible and not, older than I had been 6 months ago by an interval that had nothing to do with time, but present, real. Not a helmet and a voice and a set of technical skills, but a person, with a history, looking at a child he had chosen to love in the way you choose to love things you can't afford and do anyway. Gragu touched my face. Then he looked at the man in the dark robes, and he made his decision in the way that living creatures make the decisions that define them. Not analytically, not reluctantly, but with a clarity that looked nothing like certainty from the outside, and probably felt nothing like it from the inside, but was, in fact, both. He went with the man in the robes. The door closed. We handed Gideon to the appropriate authorities, such as they were in that part of the galaxy. Davin would recover. Keel would not, and we handled the absence of him the way soldiers handle the absence, by continuing, by numbing it honestly to ourselves in the quiet moments, by not pretending it was smaller than it was. Doom got a commission. I had expected that. She was too capable and too fundamentally decent to stay unaffiliated, and there were people in the New Republic who recognized that a soldier's worth was not diminished by the side they'd fought for. I got my ship back in good working order, my armor intact, and the particular variety of quiet that follows the end of a thing you have lived inside for a long time. People ask me what it was. Some ask out of professional curiosity, other hunters, wanting to know how a straightforward contract unraveled into everything it became. Some ask out of something more like genuine bewilderment, the kind that surfaces when a person's model of who you are turns out to be wrong. What were you to that child? What was it to you? I tell them the same thing every time. Foundling, I say, we were foundlings. And I let them make of that what they will. The outer systems are still lawless. The New Republic is still consolidating the core. The work is still plentiful if you have the skills and the stomach for it. I took a contract 6 weeks after a simple retrieval, nothing interesting. Flew out to the system, found the mark, came back. Standard operation. Professional, clean. On the way out, I flew past the planet where Keel had his homestead. The light of the 2 pale moons fell across the red stone and the canyon where we'd fought the guild hunters, and I banked the ship slightly, without planning to keep the view in my port window for an extra few minutes. Then I set the heading and went to work. Some things you carry. You don't put them down because they aren't heavy, you carry them because they're yours, and yours is different from a burden. A burden is something imposed on you. This was something I had chosen in a dirty compound room on a desert planet, when I pointed a weapon at a droid that was about to shoot a child and pulled the trigger before I knew why. I was made by people who believed some things were worth protecting regardless of cost. They died for that belief. I am still here, so is Gragu. I suppose we both learned something about what it means to endure. There is a thing that happens to soldiers after a long campaign that nobody tells you about during the campaign itself, because during the campaign you are too occupied to notice. What happens is this. The world you are fighting to protect becomes, over time, indistinguishable from the thing you are protecting it for. The mission and the reason for the mission collapse into each other. You stop being able to clearly articulate why you keep going, because the why has become so embedded in the going that separating them would require taking yourself apart. I had spent my life before Gragu as a man who kept the reason and the mission carefully separate. The mission was clear: find the mark, complete the contract, collect the payment. The reason was fuzzier, something to do with self-sufficiency, with survival, with the basic animal imperative to continue. I had not examined it closely. Examination requires stillness, and stillness had never been safe. Gragu made stillness safe. Or rather, he made stillness unavoidable. A child of his size and vulnerability required slow movements, quiet voices, the kind of patience that is not natural to a person who has been trained to operate at speed. I had to be still with him, and in that stillness I began, against my considerable resistance, to think. I thought about Keel, who had taken one look at my situation and started fixing my ship without being asked, because he was the kind of man who expressed his values through his hands rather than his mouth. I had met hundreds of people across dozens of systems in 15 years of work, and Keel was among the finest of them, and I had known him for less than a year, and the galaxy was smaller for his absence in a way that I felt specifically, not generally. I thought about Dune, who had come out of the war with her sense of humor intact, frayed at the edges, deployed mostly as armor, but intact. That requires a specific quality of human stubbornness that I recognize and respect. The universe had given her every reason to be a harder and smaller person than she was, and she had declined. That is not a small thing. I thought about the armorer, in her tunnels, hammering metal in the old way for a culture that had been systematically destroyed by people with better weapons and worse values. Keeping the creed alive in the only way you can keep a thing alive when the context that generated it has been burned, by practicing it, by saying the words, by living them forward, even if the people who first said them are gone. There is a kind of courage in that which does not look like courage from the outside. It looks like stubbornness, like denial, like an old woman in a tunnel hitting metal with a hammer. From the inside, it is the choice to mean something when meaning is expensive. I thought about the child in the empty cradle, in the room where the client's doctor had watched me take him, and had looked, if anything, relieved. Whatever the doctor knew about what was planned for Gragu, he had not been able to stop it, and he was not able to help, but he could be glad that someone else was. I wonder sometimes what became of him. I hope he found his way to a situation where he could apply his intelligence in service of something other than the remnant of a failed empire. I thought most of all about the moment in the corridor when the dark troopers were coming, and I understood that we did not have a solution. 23 machines with no fear and no fatigue and no capacity for the specific failure mode of soldiers who begin to doubt the value of the objective. We are not machines. That is frequently a disadvantage, and occasionally the only advantage that matters. In that corridor, it was only a disadvantage. We had fear and fatigue and doubt. We had bodies that could be damaged and minds that registered the damage, and a cognitive architecture that processes imminent death as a special category of problem, rather than simply an input to be acted on. What we also had was the willingness to stay in the corridor anyway. That is the thing that the machines did not have. Not capability, not firepower, not strategy. The willingness to stand in an impossible corridor and keep firing because the thing behind us was worth protecting, and we had decided that this was the case, and having decided it, we were not prepared to undecide it regardless of what the casualty projections suggested. I have never been able to explain this to people who haven't felt it. It doesn't argue well. Abstractly, it sounds like irrationality, agents refusing to update their behavior in response to updated threat assessment, which is a failure mode in most contexts. In the contexts that define you, it is the only mode that means anything. Gragu would grow up somewhere under someone's care. He would learn things I did not know how to teach him. He would become something I could not predict, in ways I would not be present to witness. This is, in the ordinary sense, loss. In another sense, the sense that I sat with in the quiet on the ship afterward on the long haul back through the dark. It is exactly what you want for something you love. You want it to grow past your capacity to contain it. You want it to exceed you. You want, eventually, not to be necessary. I was not necessary. That turned out to be the best news I had received in years. I have been asked a few times since whether I regret it. The whole of it, the detour from a clean professional life, the bodies, the losses, the burning of relationships and resources, and the quiet reputation I had spent 15 years building. Whether, if I could return to the moment in that compound room with the choice in front of me, I would choose differently. I always answer the same way. I say, a different man would have shot the droid, taken the child to the client, collected the payment, and gone back to work. And he would have been a different man on the other side of it. Not worse, necessarily, by any external accounting. He might have been more comfortable. He would certainly have had fewer enemies. But I was made by people who believed that some things were worth protecting regardless of cost. They did not make me that way by accident. They made me that way in the middle of a war, when everything was burning and cost was the only real currency left. They believed it was worth teaching. I spent 15 years not knowing what to do with that inheritance. And then a small green creature with enormous ears looked up at me from a hovering cradle, and I understood that the inheritance had been patient, and I had finally arrived at the moment it was for. This is the way. That is all there is to say. I worked alone for a while after. That is my natural state, or it had been, for long enough that I had stopped distinguishing between natural and habitual. The ship, the work, the long quiet between systems, which is as close to peace as my profession permits. Then I started noticing things I had not noticed before. A settlement on a dry moon where the water reclamation had failed and the people were weeks from a crisis point. I stopped. I have skills that are applicable to reclamation engineering in the basic sense. When you have kept a ship functional in conditions of minimal support for 15 years, you accumulate competencies. I spent 2 days. The system was not elegant when I was done, but it worked, and they would have time now to get a proper engineer out before the next dry season. An old man on a freight corridor who had been robbed by a group running protection on a stretch of space between 2 systems with no real law. The amounts involved were not significant by any objective measure. They were significant to him. I found the group. The negotiation was brief and not entirely comfortable for them. The old man got most of his cargo back. A family human, 3 generations, traveling to a colony world for reasons that were their own, whose nav system had failed in a stretch of space that doesn't see a lot of traffic. I towed them to the next waypoint. It took 6 hours. They offered payment. I declined. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 7, solemn-faced in the way of children who have inherited their parents' anxiety, watched me from behind her father's leg while we worked out the tow attachment. When I was done and they were secure, she held up a small clay figure she had made, rough, shaped like a person with a round helmet, painted in the approximate colors of my armor. She held it up like a question. I took it, I put it in my coat. She turned very red and ran back inside their ship. I still have it. It rides in a compartment by the main controls. A small lopsided clay figure, a man in armor, the paint a little worn now. It does not look like me. It looks like someone that a child imagined based on the idea of me, which is not the same thing but is, in its way, more accurate. I do not know exactly what I am in the process of becoming. I know what I was, a professional optimized for a particular application useful in the specific way of tools. I know what I am not, the man who would have left Gragu in that compound room. That man is not gone, exactly. I still have all his skills and most of his instincts and the full inventory of his damage, but he is no longer the current version. He is more like a previous model, an earlier revision. What I am now is harder to describe. Not softer, I want to be clear about that because people sometimes confuse growth with weakness and I have no patience for that confusion. I can still do the work. I can still read a room, assess a threat, calculate angles in my sleep. These things do not leave you. They are in the body, not the mind. What is different is what I will do with them. I carry the clay figure and I carry Keel's absence, and I carry the memory of 23 dark troopers coming down a corridor and the specific quality of silence that happened on the other side of that corridor when the man in dark robes was done. I carry the weight of a small green hand around 2 of my fingers in a detention cell. These things are not light. But as I said, they are mine. I chose them. You do not put down what you have chosen. Out here in the fringe, past the edge of what any government bothers to map, there are still people who need things. There are still things worth protecting. There are still moments, scattered through the long dark of this kind of life, when the choice presents itself clearly. The door and what's behind it, the mark in the cradle, the child who is not a mission but a person. I know what I do with those moments now. This is the way. The Beskar holds heat longer than standard alloys. That is one of the things you learn wearing it, not just that it is proof against most weapons, but that it remembers temperature. An hour in direct sun and the metal carries warmth for another 2. An hour in deep space cold and it takes twice that to warm again. You feel this against the body. You learn to account for it. I think about this sometimes as a kind of metaphor, which is unusual for me. I am not by nature a metaphorical thinker, but the armor remembers what it has been through. The dents and carbon scoring and the places where a blade caught an edge and left a mark that the armorer will tell you can be worked out but never fully erased. Every mark is a record of a thing that tried to end you and failed. Some people find that disturbing. I find it honest. I have been in rooms that tried to end me. I have been on ships designed to process living creatures into useful biological raw material. I have faced machines with no fear and faced men with no conscience and faced, most significantly, the version of myself that would have been easier to become. The version that left the child in the compound and went back to work and never looked in the cradle's direction again. That version is still possible in some abstract sense. He exists in the trajectory I did not take. I do not hate him. He was built from the same raw material I was built from by the same losses, and his choices would have been internally consistent and survivable. I understand him. I simply am not him. The version that is me flies back, takes the child, keeps the child, loses the child to something better than keeping, carries the loss forward as fuel rather than weight, goes back to work in the outer systems, alone in the ship, with a clay figure by the controls and a creed that means more now than it did before because it has been tested at cost and held. There is a simplicity to this that I did not anticipate and have grown to value. You find the thing worth protecting, you protect it, you pay what it costs. You do not stop paying when the cost gets high, because the cost getting high is the information that tells you the thing is worth what you thought it was. You carry what you carry. You do not put it down. In my experience, and it is a particular experience, not a general one, I make no claims about universal application. The thing that separates people who endure from people who don't is not strength. It is not intelligence or skill or access to better weapons. It is this single quality, the decision, made at the level below conscious thought, that there is something in this universe worth continuing for. I made that decision in a compound room on a desert planet, with a child looking up at me from a hovering cradle. I make it again every morning. That is the whole of the story. The rest is operational detail. The last thing I will say is this. Several months after Gragu left with the man in dark robes, I received a transmission on a frequency I had not given anyone. It was brief, no visual, just audio and not even voice audio, a sound, a small sound. The specific unintelligible vocalization of a creature I knew very well, transmitted from some distance, through some technology I couldn't trace. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. I listened to it 11 times. Then I set my heading for the next job and did not look back at the stars behind me, because looking back is for people who believe the past is where the important things happened. The important things are ahead. They always are for people who have decided to keep moving. I fly. That is enough. There are stars out here that no one has named. They are not part of any registry, not flagged on any chart I have been issued or purchased or traded for. They exist at the end of a long chain of transit points that gradually shed designation the further out you go. The named systems giving way to numbered ones, the numbered ones giving way to coordinates, And finally, the coordinates giving way to nothing. Just light in the dark that you navigate by without any institutional authority having decided what to call it. I prefer this part of the journey. In the named systems, you are a thing with a known quantity. The Guild has a file on you, the Republic has a file on you, the Remnant operations have a file on you. You exist in other people's accounting. That has its uses. Reputation is a resource, and mine is complicated now but specific, which is more valuable than clean. But it has its costs too. In the named systems, you are always partly what other people have decided you are. Out here, past the edge of the charts, you are only what you know yourself to be. I know what I am. I arrived at that knowledge late and at significant expense, but I have it now and it is clear. I'm a man who keeps the creed. A man who protects what he has decided is worth protecting. A man who flies alone but is not, in any meaningful sense, solitary, because solitude is the condition of people who have cut their connections, and my connections are simply distributed differently than most. Keel in the ground now, on the red planet. Gragu, somewhere being trained by someone who knows what he is. Dune, building something new out of what the war left. The armorer in her tunnels, making iron into armor and armor into identity. These are my people. They are not all alive. They are not all reachable. But they are present in the way that the people who have shaped you are always present. Not in the ship with you, not available for consultation, but woven into the calculations you run without knowing you're running them. When I make a decision in the field, some percentage of that decision is Keel's pragmatism. Some of it is Dune's refusal to go down. Some of it is the armorer's understanding that the creed is not a limitation but a structure, and structures are what allow people to do things they couldn't do in open space. And some of it always, some percentage I cannot quantify but can feel, is Gragu's hand around my fingers. That is perhaps an unusual thing for a man of my profession to say. I say it anyway. The unusual things are often the true ones. I passed through a system last week that had a small, struggling settlement on its third planet, water poor, soil thin, the kind of place that exists because someone had hope and stubbornness in approximately equal measure and decided to try. They had been having trouble with a predator species that came out of the rock formations at the edge of the settlement every few weeks and took livestock and occasionally threatened the perimeter. Not a war, not an organized threat. Just the universe being indifferent to human ambition in the specific way it tends to be on the frontier. I spent 4 days on it. The predators were not malicious. They were large, armored, territorial, and operating from a logic that did not include the settlement because the settlement had not been there when their behavioral patterns were established. They were not going to stop coming, but they could be redirected with enough patience and enough understanding of how they moved. I am good at understanding how things move. The settlement leader, a woman about my age with the weathered look of someone who had been doing hard things long enough that she had stopped expecting them to get easier, asked me what I wanted for the work when it was done. I thought about it for a moment. Nothing, I said. I was passing through. She looked at me the way people look at something they don't quite have a category for. Then she said, "We have hot food and a bunk that isn't the floor if you want to stop for the night before you go." I stayed one night. She fed me something with root vegetables that was considerably better than anything I had prepared for myself in recent memory. 3 children at the table stared at my armor for the entire meal in the direct, unself-conscious way that children stare at things they find interesting. The youngest reached over at one point and touched the biscar on my forearm with 2 fingers, the way you test something to see if it's real. I let her. After dinner, I walked out to the edge of the settlement and looked at the sky, which out here is the kind of sky you forget is possible when you have been in populated systems too long, wall-to-wall with light. The old light. Light that left its source before the Empire existed, or the Republic before it, or any of the human and near-human systems of authority that have organized and collapsed in this small corner of a large galaxy. All that light is just physics. The stars don't know we're here. They don't know about the purge or the war or what was lost or what was kept. They are simply burning, as they have burned for periods of time that reduce all human grief and all human triumph to a rounding error. I find this clarifying rather than diminishing. Because against that scale, the choice I made in that compound room was not important in any cosmic sense. The universe did not require me to turn around. No law, physical or otherwise, compelled it. It was simply a choice made by a person, in a moment, based on what they were. And what I was, what I had been made to be, by people who believed some things were worth protecting regardless of cost, was someone who turns around. That's all there is, that's the whole of it. The stars burn, I fly. Gragu is out there somewhere, learning things I will never know. And I keep moving. This is the way.